A lot of the stories I like to recollect and share about my past growing up have to do with situations that are humorous or funny. But I also like to recollect and recount things that I found quite interesting, if not odd. So I'm going to share a few of those with you. When I used to visit my grandmother and grandfather in Surrey County, North Carolina, in the small town not too far from Mount Airy, closer to Dobson, my grandparents were farmers, lived in an old farmhouse that was hand-built by my grandfather. He cleared all the land with a mule and an axe and became a tobacco farmer and corn farmer, whatever crops he needed to grow to feed his family and feed his animals and make a little money on the side. Now, my grandfather was an interesting old fellow. He was sort of smallish, sort of hunched over, always had a crumpled up fedora hat on as much as I could remember, a flannel shirt, old pants with suspenders, and well-worn shoes. When he would go to church, he'd wear his best bib overalls, his best hat, and sort of a tattered sport coat. Now, Grandpa and I used to like to have deep discussions about things. He and Grandma were primitive Baptist, and they had some particular beliefs. One of which was, you didn't find salvation in the Lord Jesus by just making a simple profession of faith and doing an altar call and just believing what the Bible said about salvation. The primitive Baptist believed that you needed to have a dream or a vision, or basically hear the Lord calling you to Himself. It had to be definite. It had to be real. You couldn't just hear some man preach and say, I believe that, I'm going to do it. No, that's not how they operated. They waited for the Spirit to move them. In a little bit, I'll tell you a story about how the Spirit moved my grandmother. But when talking with my grandfather about different things about the Bible, I remember one time we got talking about the Apollo missions and man landing on the moon. My grandfather said, son, that landing on the moon thing is nothing but a Hollywood trick. If God had intended man to go on the moon, He'd made a way for it. And didn't no man fly in any rocket and land on the moon. That's all a big Hollywood lie. And I couldn't believe that he didn't believe that. I said, Grandpa, we got all the pictures. We got the satellites going around the earth. He said, that's another thing that I know that it's a lie. And I said, what do you mean, Grandpa? He said, the earth is not round like they say on the TV and in the school books. I said, what do you mean? He said, the earth is flat. I said, Grandpa, they haven't believed the earth is flat since back in the days of Columbus, where they thought you'd fall off the end of the earth if you sailed too far. He said, that's right. I said, Grandpa, why do you think the earth is flat? It says in the Bible, son, about the four corners of the earth, that the angels will come from the four corners of the earth. I said, Grandpa, that's a figure of speech. But that man would not move from that belief that the earth was flat. Now, Grandma even though I talked with her many times about faith and belief and having assurance that God had saved you, she would not listen to it. She'd say, "Lord, child, don't say things like that. Nobody can know whether they are accepted of the Lord or not. Not like you're saying." Well, I tried for many years to convince Grandma to just call out on the Lord to be saved, but she said, "No, that's not how it works." Well, right around 1973, my grandfather passed, and I remember the funeral. The snow on the ground. I was asked to be one of the pallbearers. Lord, that was a sad time. But I remember the preachers, I believe there was 3 of them, that sat up at the front of the church. And the way it worked was, a primitive Baptist preacher, you did not get up and preach unless the Spirit moved you. So kind of like a tag team or a team effort, one of the other preachers might have the Spirit move him and he'd get up. And maybe the third would get up. So you didn't know any typical service, whether it's Sunday morning or a funeral service or whatever, whether you'd have 0, 1, 2, or 3 sermons. At least that's the way I understood it to happen. Well, I remember carrying the casket, and there's words being said and Grandpa being buried. And here's poor Grandma all by herself. Still hadn't joined the church, as she called it. Still hadn't made a profession of faith. And now her husband was dead and gone. Many years later, Grandmother was in her 80s. And we found out that Grandma had had a dream or a vision or a word or something that had told her it was time. It was time to join the church, to come forward, make her profession of faith, and to be baptized. I was elated. I was so thankful that Grandma had made that decision. But it was a cold, cold day. And Grandma, in her 80s, was going to go down into the waters of baptism. People were dressed in white robes. The creek was cold and flowing fast. And several men on either side of Grandma took her down into the river to baptize her. And the brothers and sisters standing on the shore of the river sang these mournful songs in shape note singing. Almost sound like something you'd hear back in the old days of the Shakers and the Amish. It was a dirge, a soulful, spiritual, deep, heartfelt dirge that set a holy tone over the whole event. And I remember right in the middle of the baptism, we heard all this splashing and crashing and footfalls of horses. And here you have it on a Sunday morning, these wild-looking men in their leather and their dungarees and hats came charging up the river, 4 or 5, maybe 6 horses. And the baptism proceedings were not deterred. People stared and looked, kept right on singing. These men twirled their horses around, and the stomping and the snorting and the strange looks, and off they rode again. It was a bizarre moment. But Grandma was gloriously baptized, and we all rejoiced in the day. Now, Grandma was a woman that didn't believe in having her picture taken. Some people have told me that the old people up in the foothills and mountains of North Carolina sort of had an Indian belief that if someone took their picture, it could be bad luck, that maybe their soul could be captured in the camera. I don't know. But I do remember Grandma would be so nervous when my brother and I would play the old pump organ in the living room, which was decorated with pictures of many of Grandma's loved ones. And she'd say, "Lord, don't knock those pictures off." I said, "Grandma, why not? Why are you so worried?" Well, Grandma believed that if a picture fell off the wall or off a piece of furniture, it was an omen that illness or bad times were coming to that person because of the fall of their picture. Call it superstition, whatever. But worse than that, Grandma believed if the picture had glass in it and that frame fell and the glass cracked, then soon that person was to die. So it makes more sense to me now that Grandma did not like the idea of having her picture taken and put in a picture frame. These were just some of the curious things that I can remember about my mother's people. Grandma, Martha Wilson, and George Wilson, my grandfather. God bless their souls. How I miss them.